Spring 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing like a structure eaten hollow by its own hatred. In a makeshift prison camp near Regensburg, a young German translator named Lieselotte Brandt, 23 years old, worked among piles of captured documents, letters, and personal belongings taken from American prisoners. Her task was simple: read, translate, report anything suspicious. But one afternoon, as rain turned the camp road into a river of brown water, she found a letter that stopped her breath. It was written in pencil, the words pressed deeply into thin American paper. "Dear Mom, I hope this war ends soon. I still keep the angel you gave me." The writer signed it, Private Robert Hayes, 29th Infantry Division. Lieselotte could have filed it away like hundreds before, but she didn't. She kept it, folded carefully inside her pocket, reading it at night under a stolen candle stub. Something about that word angel disturbed her. The same word she had once used for her own mother, killed during an air raid in Hamburg. A week later, she took a piece of torn German stationery and began to write. Not as a translator, as someone answering a voice that felt too human to belong to an enemy. She signed only "a friend," pretending to be a Red Cross clerk forwarding notes. And Robert, sitting miles away in his prisoner tent, replied. What began as an accident became an 8-month exchange, each letter a small rebellion against the machinery of nations. They wrote about weather, about the smell of coffee they missed, about brothers who never returned. He told her about cornfields in Ohio. She told him about the Elbe at sunset. Neither knew the other's face. In October 1945, when Germany lay in ruins and the Americans prepared to ship the last prisoners home, the truth came out. Robert received a final note, written shakily. "I was never with the Red Cross. I only wanted to understand why someone who called my people monsters could still call his mother an angel." He read it 3 times, then tucked it into his breast pocket as he boarded a transport truck toward Munich. That winter, a train from Frankfurt stopped in a small town outside Nuremberg. A woman stepped down carrying a worn suitcase. Inside it, a single letter in English. When Robert turned and saw her, neither saluted nor spoke. The war had built walls between them, but 8 months of ink had already laid a bridge. By spring 1946, they married in a civilian ceremony witnessed by a handful of local farmers and one army chaplain who didn't ask questions. Their first dance took place on cracked cobblestones outside the registry office with no music, only the ticking of a field clock left from the war. Their love began with a wrong delivery, a letter sent to the enemy that found its way to a heart instead of a mailbox. In the ruins of Europe, that mistake became the first chapter of forgiveness. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are now. Autumn 1945. Cologne was a skeleton city, 90% of it flattened, the cathedral standing like a survivor refusing to kneel. Among the rubble walked Captain James Whitaker, 30 years old, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He had been part of the air raids that burned the Rhine's bridges, and now, by irony or justice, was ordered to rebuild them. The Army called it reconstruction. To James, it felt like confession through labor. One morning, his team received orders to clear a collapsed residential block near Eigelstein Gate. As bulldozers groaned through the wreckage, he saw movement among the stones. A woman, pale, coated in ash, sitting beside what had once been her doorway. She was Anna Keller, 28, former nurse, widow, living alone since her parents had died during the last winter of the war. When James approached, she didn't stand or curse. She simply asked if he could help her find her mother's locket. He knelt and sifted through debris until his gloves tore. Under a slab of broken marble, he found a small oval pendant, its hinge bent, inside a faded photograph of 2 smiling women by the Rhine. He returned it to her silently, and then, breaking military decorum, he said, "I think I bombed this street." She looked up, holding the locket tightly. "Then you should help me rebuild it." That night, he couldn't sleep. For months, he had built bridges of steel, but this was the first request to build a human bridge. Over the next weeks, James brought extra materials from the depot, spare planks, nails, and a few tins of army rations. He repaired her roof first, then her windows, patching bullet holes with boards stamped U.S. property. She cooked the only thing she had, potato soup thickened with breadcrumbs. When he arrived one evening with a new hammer, she offered the last bowl. He hesitated, then accepted. The soup was bland, the room cold, but something in that quiet meal thawed both of them. They spoke little, only the necessary words to bridge two languages. Danke. Please. Good night. Later, in a small notebook he kept hidden under his uniform flap, James wrote, "I used to think we dropped bombs to win wars. Now I think we build houses to win peace." By winter 1946, the army began repatriating engineers. On his final day in Cologne, Anna gave him the locket, now repaired, and said softly, "For your mother, or for mine." When he left, the street was still half rubble, but her doorway stood upright again. A year later, he returned. Not in uniform, but in a plain suit, carrying flowers and a ring made from salvaged aircraft aluminum. Their wedding photo, taken in front of the rebuilt doorway, showed two people smiling awkwardly. The caption written years later on the back read, "From ruins to home." If you had destroyed someone's entire world, would you have had the courage to rebuild it with your bare hands? Frankfurt, 1946. The air still smelled of ash and cement dust, but the markets had reopened, trading everything from coffee to old uniforms. In a narrow alley behind the Hauptbahnhof, a seamstress named Greta Hoffmann stitched together whatever fabric she could find to keep her small workshop alive. Parachute silk, military blankets, even tablecloths. She had survived the bombings, lost her brother at Stalingrad, and now worked mostly for war widows who wanted their mourning dresses repaired. One afternoon, an American soldier entered her shop, ducking under the crooked doorframe. His name was Sergeant Daniel Brooks from Michigan. He had met Greta during food distribution shifts, where she helped translate for German families too proud to beg. Over time, he began stopping by with small gifts. A can of peaches, a bar of soap, a smile that carried no orders. Their friendship grew quietly in the shadow of curfews and ration lines. When Daniel proposed, Greta laughed in disbelief. "I don't even have a dress," she said. He looked down at the stack of old US Army maps on the counter. Maps of Europe, creased and stained, showing front lines already gone. "Then we'll use these," he said. They spent days collecting scraps of white parachute silk from a supply depot. Greta traced each map piece into curved panels, sewing them between strips of silk like memories stitched into fabric. The neckline was edged with red thread taken from a medical kit. The hem carried faint printed words: Antwerp, Munich, Bremen. Every place marked a battle he had fought or a city she had lost. When she tried it on, Daniel stared, speechless. The maps, once tools of destruction, had become the pattern of a new beginning. The local photographer called it the dress that ended the war. Their wedding took place in an abandoned Wehrmacht warehouse, now used by the Allied Relief Office. There was no music, only the echo of boots on concrete and the hum of a generator lighting a single bulb above them. The priest spoke both German and English, alternating vows like translations of hope. Greta carried a bouquet of paper flowers folded from ration booklets. After the ceremony, the workers in the relief office pinned their leftover ribbons to her dress, laughing for the first time in months. Someone whispered that the skirt looked like Europe, learning to breathe again. In his diary that night, Daniel wrote, "We fought across these maps, now she wears them. Maybe that's what peace means. Not forgetting, but carrying it differently." Years later, that same dress was displayed in a Frankfurt museum. The curator noted that the red-stitched lines matched the Allied advance of 1944, and the faint tear near her heart aligned with the city of Dresden. No one could tell if it was coincidence or design, but everyone who saw it felt the same quiet truth, that the most powerful transformation after war is not rebuilding cities, but remaking meaning. Bavaria, 1946. The mountains stood silent under late spring snow, hiding the scars of war that still ran through villages and hearts alike. In the small town of Füssen, within the ruins of a Romanesque chapel, a 51-year-old priest named Father Josef Müller wrestled with a moral battle fiercer than any fought with guns. The Allied Occupation Authority had issued a strict order: no marriages between American soldiers and German women without military approval. To many, it was law. To Müller, it was a commandment against compassion. He had seen too many funerals, too many confessions, soaked with guilt from both sides. In his journal he wrote, War ends on paper long before it ends in the soul. So when a young couple, Corporal William Bill Lawson of the 4th Infantry and Margaret Becker, a baker's daughter from Augsburg, came to him one night begging to be married, he hesitated only long enough to pray. They stood in his rectory cellar, still smelling of wine and mildew. The only light came from a single oil lamp, flickering across the curved ceiling once used to store communion barrels. Father Mueller poured wine from a dusty bottle left by retreating soldiers and whispered, "Tonight, this will serve as our chalice." He performed the ceremony in near silence, translating each line into both languages so the couple could understand what they were promising. When the vows were done, Margaret wept, not from joy, but from disbelief that something sacred could survive among so much ruin. Bill removed the ring he had fashioned from his dog tag and placed it on her finger. Mueller raised his hands in blessing, aware that if discovered, he could lose his position or worse. A week later, military police came to the parish. Someone had reported him. He stood before the Allied tribunal and admitted everything. "I married them," he said, "because peace cannot grow where love is forbidden." The tribunal dismissed him from his post, labeling his actions misconduct under occupation authority. For months, he lived quietly in a small farm cottage, planting potatoes and repairing fences. Yet couples continued to visit him in secret. Some German, some American, some British. Each time he repeated the same ritual, always with the same wine bottle, its label faded but intact. In 1952, after the restrictions were finally lifted, his name reappeared in the Bavarian parish register, reinstated with a short note, "Returned with honor." By then, he had married 214 couples, all without permission. On his tombstone in Füssen, carved years later, were 5 words that summarized both his rebellion and his faith. God has no nationality. Some called him disobedient, others called him holy. But everyone who knew his story understood that he had chosen the only side worth taking, the side of humanity itself. Berlin, 1947. The city was a chessboard of rubble and zones, divided by flags before the walls ever rose. Among the crowds waiting at Tempelhof Air Base for American aid flights stood Elena Weiss, 30 years old, holding a baby wrapped in a gray blanket. The child's name was John Hans, John for his father, an American corporal now back in Illinois, and Hans for her brother, killed in the Reich's final defense. She had met Corporal John Miller during reconstruction work the previous year. He was kind, shy, always whistling the same tune from home. For 6 months, they shared letters, rationed tins, and dreams of a life after uniforms. Then, suddenly, he was gone, transferred without notice, leaving only a note. "If this war ever lets me, I'll come back." The baby was born that winter during the coldest February since 1888. Coal was scarce, food scarcer. Elena traded her wedding ring from a previous life for milk powder and cloth. Neighbors whispered about occupation babies, half loved and half judged, but she ignored them. Her boy's hair was lighter than hers, his eyes a calm American blue. In 1965, almost 2 decades later, that child, now a man, stood among a crowd in front of the Brandenburg Gate. The city was no longer rubble, but still divided by an idea. He was there for a memorial ceremony marking the 20th anniversary of the war's end. On the stage, a U.S. veteran was speaking about reconciliation. John Hans froze. The man's voice, steady, unmistakable, was the same one that had sung lullabies through his mother's old radio when she missed him. After the ceremony, he approached. "Are you John Miller?" The veteran turned, eyes wide, his hair graying at the temples. They stared at each other for a long, suspended second, until the younger man said quietly, "My name is John Hans. My mother was Elena." The air between them seemed to collapse. Miller reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photograph. A young German woman holding a baby. "I carried this for 20 years, he whispered. That day, they didn't talk about the past. Not about the letters lost or the ocean that had divided them. They simply walked through the city that had once burned, now lit with neon and memory. Before parting, the son said, "I don't know who won the war, but I know I am the result of forgiveness." A journalist covering the event overheard and later quoted it in an article titled "The Generation Between Flags." It became a symbol of post-war identity. children who carried two heritages and refused to hate either side. For millions born of such unions, in Germany, Japan, Italy, even the Philippines, life began not in peace, but in its fragile aftermath. They were living proof that war's greatest victory wasn't in the treaties, but in the children who refused to inherit vengeance. Tell me, if you were that child, born between conqueror and conquered, which flag would you salute? Or would you choose to carry both? Würzburg, 1950. The air smelled of coal and rain as Clara Engel, 32, waited at the small post office beside the River Main. She had written 100 letters over 3 years, all addressed to Sergeant Thomas Reed, her American husband, who had been transferred to Korea during the New War. None had been answered. Every morning she came to check, hoping the clerk might say, "There's something from America." Every morning, he only shook his head. They had met in 1946, when Thomas was stationed with the military police. He had been tall, quiet, his German halting, but kind. Clara worked as a clerk in the housing office, helping translate paperwork for war brides. It was bitterly ironic that she ended up one herself, a German woman who married the man meant to guard her country's ruins. Their wedding photo showed them standing under a cherry tree in spring, both squinting at the sun, holding hands awkwardly. That photograph was the only one they ever took together. When Thomas was deployed, he promised he'd send for her once his tour ended, but then the letters stopped. Rumors from the base said his unit had been ambushed near Pusan. No official telegram ever came, just silence that stretched across oceans. Years passed. Clara never remarried. She kept their photo framed beside a small oil lamp, its glass smoked from years of burning. Neighbors would sometimes see her in the evening sitting on the balcony, talking softly in English to the wind. "Good night, Tom," she would say, and blow out the light. In 1971, when illness finally took her to the hospital, she gave her neighbor an envelope with careful instructions. "When I'm gone, bury this with me." Inside was the photograph, slightly faded, the corners cracked, and on the back she had written, "He came as an enemy, left as my home." At her funeral, the priest read her note aloud. The mourners, a few old friends, 2 local shopkeepers, and 1 American veteran visiting from Frankfurt, stood silently. The veteran later wrote in his journal, "I've seen medals buried with soldiers, but never a photograph buried with love." Decades later, during a renovation of the old cemetery, workers found the grave. Inside the coffin's preserved lining was that same photo, still legible despite time. It became an exhibit in a small local museum dedicated to post-war reconciliation. Visitors often paused before it longer than any uniform or medal, because it wasn't just an image of 2 people. It was proof that love had dared to bloom in the unlikeliest soil, the union of 2 nations that had once tried to destroy each other. If you could leave one thing behind to be found decades later, not money, not possessions, but a symbol of what you lived for, what would it be? Bavaria, 1945. In the first weeks after Germany's surrender, American commanders faced a new kind of battlefield, not of soldiers, but of hearts. Headquarters in Frankfurt issued Directive No. 106, a strict order forbidding all fraternization between U.S. troops and German civilians. No friendship, no correspondence, no marriage. It was meant to keep emotions from clouding the victory. But among the stacks of regulations sat one officer who believed otherwise. His name was Colonel Richard Donovan, 44, a lawyer before the war and commander of the Allied Civil Affairs Division in Bavaria. He had seen the faces of civilians lining the roads when his convoy rolled in, not defiance, but exhaustion. When his men began forming quiet attachments with local women, he didn't punish them. Instead, he asked a question no manual could answer. If peace means separation, what have we really won? The first case came across his desk that June. Private Henry Collins, a medic from Chicago, wanted to marry Inga Bauer, a nurse from Würzburg who had once treated wounded Wehrmacht soldiers. Their request was denied twice. The third time, Donovan quietly signed the papers himself. Soon word spread. Within months, over 200 couples in his sector had unofficial approvals, all bearing his discreet signature. He wasn't naive. He knew that Washington disapproved, that his signature risked his career. But to him, reconciliation began not with speeches, but with 2 people choosing to share a table instead of a trench. Peace begins with a family, he often said to his adjutant, who later recorded the phrase in his memoir. When inspectors discovered the forged authorizations, Donovan was court-martialed for violating occupation policy. During the hearing, he refused to defend himself. He simply stated, "I disobeyed to obey humanity." The sentence was suspension and loss of pension, but the couples he had united kept their marriages. Some even sent him photographs of their children inscribed, "For the man who believed in us." By 1950, the fraternization ban was officially lifted. The U.S. Congress passed the War Brides Act, allowing thousands of German, Italian, and Japanese spouses to enter America legally. In the first year alone, 7,420 German women arrived at U.S. ports, each carrying a suitcase, a visa, and a dream that love could outlive propaganda. Colonel Donovan lived long enough to see one of his couples celebrate their silver anniversary in Boston. He received a handwritten invitation that read, "To the officer who broke a law so we could build a home." History books rarely mention him, but in every photograph of a German bride stepping off a ship, clutching her papers against the wind, his invisible signature was there, proof that one man's rebellion helped turn enemies into families. Sometimes the bravest act in war is not the order you follow, but the one you refuse. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world expected ruins, not weddings. Yet amid the ash and silence, people reached for something older than ideology: the need to be understood. A letter misdelivered across a prison fence, a soldier rebuilding a house he once destroyed, a dress stitched from the maps of war, a priest defying orders to bless what politics forbade. These were not grand gestures of nations, but quiet revolutions of the human heart. Each story began in contradiction: enemies who became lovers, laws that tried to stop tenderness, faith that spoke in two languages over a single candle flame. And through them, a different history was written, one not found in treaties or victory parades, but in kitchens, in back gardens, in homes rebuilt brick by hesitant brick. By 1952, more than 20,000 German women had married American soldiers. By 1955, over 100,000 war brides from former Axis nations had crossed the ocean to start new lives. They carried no medals, only photographs, recipes, lullabies, small symbols of reconciliation that could fit inside a suitcase. Many faced suspicion or silence. Others built communities of their own. Their children grew up speaking two tongues, saluting two flags, embodying what their parents had risked everything for: the belief that peace was possible not by decree, but by choice. History often celebrates conquest, but the truer victory lies in the courage to hold a hand once considered forbidden. These marriages, born in the rubble of hatred, did not erase the war. They redeemed its aftermath. Somewhere, perhaps, an old soldier still dreams of a woman who translated his letter. Somewhere, a photograph still rests beside a faded wedding dress made of war maps. Together, they whisper the same lesson: love does not end wars, but it makes surviving them worthwhile.